$55, Emmett Prine said, and the man standing beside him laughed out loud, because the thing they were bidding on weighed 6 tons and had not turned a revolution since 1961. It was the 12th of October, 1996, a Saturday at a machinery dispersal 9 miles east of Cravens Mill, Indiana. Lawson Kirch had hauled other men's iron for 51 years, and he had died in August at 92, and his nephews were selling out the yard, the shed, and both barns behind it. Colonel Ott Renfro had been calling since 8 in the morning. He had sold 41 chain hoists, a rack of pipe threaders, a lowboy trailer, 300 feet of conveyor, and a wall of pillow blocks, and at 2:30 he walked 130 people out past the corn crib to the last lot on the bill sheet, which had been lying in the same patch of grass since 1963. The bill sheet called it one ice machine, as it sets. It was 11 feet long on oak skid timbers thick enough to sit on. 2 ribbed cast iron cylinders lay horizontal, in line, behind a crosshead and a connecting rod, and at the near end stood a spoked flywheel 7 feet across, still bright in one worn band where a belt had run on it 35 years before. 6 brass oil cups stood along the top, gone the color of old cider. The ammonia stop valves carried round handwheels the size of dinner plates. The paint had been a dark bottle green once. It was chalk now, and under the chalk the iron had turned orange and the weeds had grown up through the frame, so that the whole machine looked like a locomotive somebody had taken apart and then lost interest in. Colonel Renfro asked for $500 and got silence. He asked for $250 and got silence. He asked the crowd, honestly, whether anybody standing there could even tell him what it was, and a heavy-set man in a mustard-tan jacket at the front gave the yard its verdict. That was Curtis Yancey, who bought scrap iron in 3 counties and knew to the pound what a load was worth. "It's $200 of iron," Yancey said, "and $500 of trouble." That got the laugh, and it deserved the laugh, because it was true. To move that machine, you needed a lowboy, a wrecker, and a permit. To cut it up where it lay, you needed 2 men, a bottle of oxygen, and a day. And at the end of the day, you had $200 of shred and a sore back. There was no motor on it, no belt, no piping, and no place at all in 1996 for a machine that made cold with ammonia, a wide flat belt, and a flywheel. Every plant in the state that still froze ice had bought its equipment in the 1970s and would replace it with something the size of a chest freezer. So Colonel Renfro, who did not like to leave a lot unsold on the last call of a long day, said he would take any bid anybody cared to make. And a man of 61 in bib overalls and a straw hat gone the color of a feed sack said $55. Yancey turned around to see who it was. Then he laughed, and he said the second thing that got repeated in Cravens Mill all winter. "Emmett," he said, "you just bought the world's heaviest lawn ornament. Nobody bid against him." The field went quiet in the way a field goes quiet when it has decided something about a man, and Colonel Renfro said sold, and a woman with a clipboard wrote out a pale yellow paper tag with $55 on it and wired it to the rim of the flywheel. Emmet kept that tag. It is worth mentioning now because 9 months later, a lawyer in a good suit asked him on the record what he had paid for the machine, and instead of answering, Emmet reached into his shirt pocket and laid the tag face up on the table. Here is what the field did not know about the man who bid. Emmett Prine had spent 40 years as a refrigeration mechanic, not a collector, not a dealer. He had never once in his life bought a thing because it was old. He fixed cold rooms and packing house compressors and milk tank chillers and the ice machines behind 24 small-town lockers, and he had retired in 1993 with a shoulder that would not raise past his ear and a pension of $711 a month. And in the summer of 1953, at 18, in his first week of work, he had oiled a machine exactly like the one lying in Lawson Kirch's weeds, not similar to it. The same model, out of the same shop, a Hemmerly 15-ton horizontal double-acting ammonia compressor, which meant it would freeze 15 tons of ice in 24 hours, which in 1913 was the entire cooling capacity of a river town. If you've made it this far into Emmett's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The plant was the Ohio Valley Ice and Cold Storage Company at Farrell's Landing, 40 miles down the river from where Emmett was standing in the grass. A brick building with a stepped parapet and a tall stack, put up in 1913, and for 50 years it cooled everything anybody in that county ate. The chief engineer there was a man named Virgil Popst, who had a way of teaching that consisted mostly of standing beside you saying nothing until you got it wrong. What Virgil taught Emmett in the first week was where to look. The gauges lie, Virgil said. The line don't. He meant the suction line, the pipe carrying cold gas back to the compressor. When the machine was pulling the way it should, frost crept out along that pipe. A fine white fur you could write your name in, and how far the frost had traveled told you what was happening inside a machine you could not see into. Too little frost, and it was short of gas. Too much, and liquid was coming back where liquid should never be. Emmett Prine spent 40 years reading pipes because a man showed him frost when he was 18. He worked at Farrell's Landing until 1957. The plant sold its last block of ice in 1969, and then the building sat shut for 26 years with all of its machinery still bolted to the floor, which is the only reason any of the rest of this happened. In 1995, the building was bought by a partnership that meant to turn it into 34 apartments. The plant had been listed on the National Register in 1988. And a listed building carries a particular kind of money with it, a federal rehabilitation tax credit worth 20% of what you spend fixing it up. On a $7 million conversion, that credit came to $1.4 million, and the partnership had already sold it forward to a bank the way it is done. The credit has one condition, and every developer who takes it learns the condition by heart. You are not paid for making an old building pretty. You are paid for keeping the things that make it that building. The approved plan for Farrell's Landing named the machine room and the ice machine standing in it as character-defining features to be kept in place, cleaned, and made operable as an exhibit behind glass in the lobby. That was in the application. The application had been approved. The approval was the thing the bank had paid for. In March of 1996, the partnership's site superintendent, who wanted the floor space and had never read the application, hired 2 men with cutting torches. It took them 4 days. The Hemmerly machine that had cooled a county for 50 years went out of that building in pieces on a roll-off, and the flywheel. 7 feet of cast iron that 6 men could not have lifted was broken up with a drop ball at the shredder yard. Nobody meant anything wicked by it, and that is worth saying plainly. The superintendent thought he was clearing out a room full of junk, which is exactly what everybody had thought about that machine for 27 years. The State Preservation Office found out in June on a routine site visit when a reviewer walked into the machine room and found a swept concrete floor with 12 sheared anchor bolts standing up out of it. What followed was not a lawsuit. It was quieter than that, and worse. The reviewer's report went to the federal office that certifies these projects, and a letter came back saying that the project as built no longer matched the project as approved, and that final certification would be denied. Denial meant the $1.4 million was gone. It also meant the portion already claimed would be taken back, and the bank's participation agreement had a clause about exactly that. The partnership's own lawyer put their exposure at $1.4 million and rising. So the partnership asked what it would take to fix it, and the answer came back in one sentence that decided everything afterwards. Replace the removed equipment in kind. Same class, same period, same capacity, back on the original mounting, operable, not a photograph of it. Not a modern compressor painted green. Not a mock-up in fiberglass. An ammonia machine of that type, that size and that age, that would turn. There is a reason that sentence was so expensive. Belt-driven double-acting ammonia compressors were built by the thousand between 1890 and 1930, and then they were replaced, and the replaced ones were not put in museums. They were cut up in the metal drives of the 1940s. They were cut up again in the 1950s when the piping changed. They were cut up a third time in the 1970s when ammonia went out of small plants altogether, and every one of them was 6 tons of clean gray iron sitting in a building that needed the floor. Almost all of them went. By the autumn of 1996, a consultant working for the partnership had spent 4 months on the telephone and turned up 3 machines in the whole country. One stood on a concrete pad in a park in Texas, welded down, with its cylinders gone. One was in a museum in Ohio, and one, though the consultant had no way of knowing it, lay in the grass 9 miles east of Cravens Mill with weeds through its frame. Emmett knew all of it. He got the State Preservation Office's quarterly bulletin because he had written to them once about a cold storage building, and the item about Farrell's Landing ran to half a page. He read the 3 paragraphs the Farrell's Landing paper gave it. He knew precisely what had gone into that roll-off because he had oiled it. And when Lawson Kirch's sale bill came in the mail in September with the Line 1 ice machine as it sets, he drove over on the Thursday before the sale, waded out into the grass, wiped the mud off the nameplate with his thumb, and read the word Hemmerly. Then he went home and told nobody for 9 days. Getting it out of that field cost him more than 20 times what he paid for it. A lowboy and a wrecker and 2 men and half a day, $1,150. It came up out of the grass on its own skids and went the 9 miles at 15 miles an hour, and most of Cravens Mill saw it go by. Emmett Prine met it in the lane. She had been married to him 38 years, and she asked him one question, which was whether he had bought it or whether somebody had given it to him. When he said $55 and $150, she went back in the house and got a pencil. That autumn there were exactly 2 opinions about Emmett Prine in that township. The kinder one was that a retired man is entitled to a hobby. The other one was Curtis Yancey's, and Yancey had a gift for a phrase, and by November people were saying lawn ornament without smiling. Emmett did almost nothing to the machine, and this part matters more than anything he did later. He set it level on 6 railroad ties in his machine shed. He pulled the covers. He washed 35 years of chaff and mouse nest out of the frame with kerosene. He took the 6 oil cups off and cleaned them at the kitchen sink. And then he put a 4-foot bar between 2 spokes of the flywheel and leaned on it. 6 tons of iron went over. slow, then easier, then with a rhythm to it, the crossheads sliding in their guides, and at the far end of each stroke a discharge valve gave one small dry click like a knuckle. He rolled it around 6 or 7 times. Then he held a sheet of newspaper over the discharge port and rolled it again, and the paper jumped. Then he stood in the shed a while with his hand on it. That is the whole of what he did in October. He restored nothing, because nothing needed restoring. Everything that machine had ever had, it still had. Weather is not what finishes a machine like that. 2 years in a shed and 33 in the grass had taken the paint and roughened the surface and done nothing whatever to a casting 2 inches thick. What finishes them is a torch, and nobody had ever laid one on it. On the 4th of November, he wrote a letter, 1 page, on lined paper, to the partnership's project manager, a woman named Diane Rooch. He told her plainly what he had, where it came from, that it was a Hemmerly 15-ton of the same period as the machine they had lost, and that it turned over by hand. 2 people came out on the 19th, Diane Rooch and the preservation consultant Nathan Ostrander. They looked at it for 40 minutes. Ostrander took 30 photographs, measured the bed plate and the cylinder bores and wrote the numbers in a notebook, and Emmett answered everything he was asked and made them coffee. Then Diane Rooch offered him $1,500 for it. Emmett said no. He said it without any heat at all. He said the machine was worth what it was worth to them, and that he would rather they told him what the fix was worth than tell him what the iron was worth. Ostrander then said something that Emmett wrote down that evening, because it was said kindly and it was clearly meant to close the subject. He said there was another machine, a better example, in a museum in Ohio, that it had been offered to the project on loan, and that the partnership expected to have it on a truck by January. They shook hands. They drove off. And for 11 weeks, Emmett Prine owned 6 tons of iron that had cost him $1,205 to buy and haul, in a township that had already made up its mind about him. That is the part people forget when they hear how this ends. It was not 11 weeks of quiet confidence. Alma's pencil column had a number at the bottom of it. Curtis Yancey stopped at the end of the lane in December and offered, in front of a witness, to take the lawn ornament off his hands for $300, and pointed out, correctly, that $300 was more than the iron would bring. Emmett said no to that, too. And then he did the thing that decided the entire business, and it was not a clever thing. It was the opposite of clever. He drove 310 miles to Ohio to look at the other machine. He went in the first week of December on his own money in a truck with 190,000 miles on it, and he did not go to catch anybody out. He went because he had spent 40 years being told there were none of these left, and here was one, and he wanted to see it. He half hoped it would be perfect. A perfect machine in Ohio meant the thing was settled, and he could stop lying awake. The Mauk County Industrial Museum had it on a low platform in a hall with a rope around it, lit nicely, painted a fresh dark green with a card beside it explaining what it was. It looked better than his. From 10 feet away it looked like the day it left Cincinnati. Emmett stepped over the rope and got down on his knees at the far end. The bedplate had been cut in 2. It had been done in 1974. The museum's own card said the machine came out of a basement dairy that year, and it had been done for the plainest reason in the world: the machine would not go up the stairs whole, so somebody put a cutting torch through the bedplate between the 2 main bearings, brought it out in halves, and welded it back together on the platform with a steel strap 3 feet long and 8 bolts. You can weld a bedplate. you cannot make it straight again. The bedplate of a machine like that is one casting for a reason. It holds the crankshaft bearings in a line to a few thousandths of an inch, and a casting that has been cut, pulled about by the heat, and strapped back together is out of line forever, and a crankshaft laid into it will bind or knock or run hot inside an hour. And there was no crankshaft. Emmett looked for 20 minutes and worked out that the crank throw was a length of pipe and 2 plates, painted to match, holding the flywheel at the right height for the photograph. The connecting rods were bolted to nothing at all. The Ohio machine was a beautiful thing to look at, and it would never turn again. He drove home. On the 9th of December, he telephoned Nathan Ostrander and told him exactly that, in about 90 seconds, without one word about price. Ostrander thanked him. And then, politely, in the voice of a professional man handling an interested party, he said that, of course, the museum's example would be examined by their own people in due course, which is a courteous way of saying, you would say that, wouldn't you? Their own people looked at it on the 21st of January, 1997. It took the partnership's mechanical engineer 15 minutes to find the strap and about a minute after that to find the pipe where a crankshaft should have been. He wrote a 2-page memorandum, and the last line of it said the museum machine could be exhibited and could not be operated, and that the difference was the entire point. The Federal reviewer on Farrell's Landing was a woman named Marion Delahunt, and she had put in writing months earlier what operable meant, because she had watched developers try the other thing before. Operable meant it turns under its own belt, on its own bearings, in the room it was approved for. On the 3rd of February, 4 vehicles came up Emmett Prine's lane. Diane Rooch, Nathan Ostrander, the partnership's engineer, Marion Delahunt, a lawyer and a photographer. They stood in a cold machine shed in Indiana around 6 tons of iron sitting on 6 railroad ties. And Alma made coffee for 7 people and then stayed in the house. The engineer went over it for 2 hours. He measured the bore and the stroke and the length of the bed plate and the distance between the anchor bolt centers. He read the nameplate and the pattern numbers cast into the frame. He found what he was always going to find: one casting, uncut, unwelded, unbored, complete, with its own crankshaft, its own rods, its own valves, and its own flywheel, exactly as it had been poured in 1913, short of 2 oil cup covers and a drain plug. Then Emmett handed Marion Delahunt the 4-foot bar and asked her whether she would like to do it. She was 54 years old and in a good coat in a shed in February. She put the bar between 2 spokes and pushed, and 6 tons of cast iron went over. The crosshead slid. The valves clicked, twice, dry and small. Emmett held the sheet of newspaper over the discharge port, and she rolled it again, and the paper jumped in her hand. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Marion Delahunt straightened up and said, "That is the machine." The negotiating took 6 weeks, and it was not friendly at the start. The partnership opened at $12,000 and explained reasonably that the object itself was worth $200 as scrap and that $12,000 was generous. Emmett Prine's answer is the sentence the whole story turns on, and he did not raise his voice to say it. "I know what the iron's worth," he said. "You're not buying iron." They were buying $1.4 million. They were buying a bank's participation agreement and 34 apartments and a certification signed off, and the one object in America that could unlock all of it was sitting in a shed 40 miles away. The lawyer asked him, on the record, what he had paid for it. And that is when the pale yellow tag came out of the shirt pocket and went face up on the table. $55. In pencil, wired to a flywheel in a field in October. They settled on the 14th of March, 1997, $85,000 for the machine and $150 a day for Emmett Prine to go with it and help set it, line it, belt it, and start it, which came to 38 days and $5,700 more. It went back to Farrell's Landing on the 2nd of April on a lowboy, and it dropped onto the original anchor bolts, the same 12 the reviewer had found, sheared off in a swept floor, drilled out and retapped, which surprised nobody who knew that a Hemmerly 15-ton is a Hemmerly 15-ton. They started it on the 11th of June, 1997. There were 60 people in the room, and most of them had come for the free coffee. A 15-horsepower motor took up the belt. The flywheel began to turn, and a sound came up with it. Not a roar, but a slow, deep breathing. 92 revolutions a minute. The sound a river town used to sleep to. Emmett Prine was not watching the flywheel. He was watching the suction line. It came about 4 minutes in. A white bloom on the pipe near the valve, spreading a foot. Then, too, a fine dry frost creeping out along iron in a room that had not been cold since 1969. Somebody wrote their initials in it with a fingernail. He was 62 years old. He had first seen that happen in that same room at 18, which was 43 years and 40 miles and one entire working life earlier. And the man who taught him what it meant had been gone since 1981. Here's the part worth keeping. Everything the auction yard said about that machine in October of 1996 was correct. It was 6 tons of obsolete iron. It made nothing anybody wanted. It was worth $200 at the shredder and $500 of trouble to get it there, and Curtis Yancey, who priced it out loud in front of 130 people, is one of the best judges of scrap in southern Indiana and was not wrong by $1. They were pricing the object. Emmett Prine was pricing the problem it solved, and the strangest part of all of it is that his machine was only worth $85,000 because of one cut somebody made in Ohio in 1974. A torch through a bedplate. A sensible decision. The only way anybody had to get 6 tons of iron up a flight of stairs. If that cut had never been made, there would have been 2 whole machines in America instead of 1, and his would have been worth exactly what the yard said it was worth. Virgil Pobst used to say a thing about ice standing in that machine room in 1953, and he meant it about the trade and not about anything larger. Ice ain't worth what it costs to make, he said. It's worth what it saves.